Hey guys, it's Sign here with HobbiesofaMan once again, and today I want to do a kind of conversational, rambly type review over Shogun. We're halfway through the season right now. There's 5 episodes out, 5 are left. I think this is a miniseries that's not going to have a continuation, so there won't be any more seasons after this one. And on one hand, I'm kind of sad about this because this series is phenomenal, right? But at the same time, I'm kind of happy about it because having multi-season shows is not necessarily the end-all be-all, right? Like, if it only takes 10 episodes to make the series work, then that is all it should take, right? And so, even though it's going to be a bit kind of sad when the series ends, I'm quite happy about it because the series so far has been great, and I am sure that it will continue to be so until the very end, right? So, I will tell you what Shogun is about in a second, but in general, my impressions of this show are that it's phenomenal, that it's really great. I love how amazing and full of texture and color and vibrancy everything is, and also how interesting the character dynamics are, right? Like, they're not necessarily very bombastic, large types of characters. They're all pretty reserved, right? Because that's kind of like a Japanese kind of vibe, right? But within those reservations, there's a lot of complexity that I find really, really enjoyable. And also, I do find that there's certain things that I really, really enjoy. First of all, I like the concept of like a fish out of water type story. And I think that this like introduction of a crass English sailor into a very polite and well kind of like segmented society is quite good. I find a lot of humor in the misunderstandings and just lack of compromise between the two groups, right? Like, John calls them a savage, and then Yabushika calls him a savage back without understanding that what they're doing to each other. And I find that quite humorous most of the time, right? Sometimes it can be kind of fucked up, but usually I think it's pretty funny, right? And I really enjoy these kind of misunderstandings because one, they're pretty understandable, right? So they make the kind of humor aspect a bit funnier, but also they're kind of ironic that these two people from completely different kind of worldviews and points of origin are thinking the exact same thought process of each other, right? So I find that to be quite enjoyable. And also I think that the delicate approach to how these characters interact is quite good as well, right? So, yeah, let's see, what else is there to say in general? I had like a bunch of thoughts, and now that I'm recording, it feels like all of them drifted away, right? But, yeah, I guess I'll start with telling you what Shogun is about, right? So Shogun is a modern show. It's 10 episodes long. It's supposed to be new, proper, very authentic to the Japanese side of things adaptation of James Clavell's old novel. There's more novels in the series, but there's like a big time jump between Shogun and the next one, which is called Taipan or Gaijin. I can't remember which one is in what order. And James Clavell was actually a World War II soldier. He was a prisoner of war for the Japanese. He was from Britain, actually. I thought he was American, but he is British. He was a prisoner of war, and you can probably see how this kind of influenced the book, right? I don't think he suffered really as badly as he did, and or as he could have done, which is probably why he was able to write this, but I'm not really sure. I've never read the book personally, and I really do want to read it, but it's actually kind of impossible to find. I think it's only published by a British company, and they've done a bad job of making it available here in the US, right? I think it's Blackstone, I think is what they're called, or Black, yeah, I think it is Blackstone, something like that. There's a really nice black faux leather bound book, but that edition is like impossible to get. And the new editions that have like the modern show, tie-in covers are pretty hard to get. The book is split into 2 because it's over 1,000 pages long. And each of those paperbacks is about $30, so I'm not going to bother buying that. And the digital versions are like $8, which is, again, pretty expensive for a digital book, so I'm not going to bother buying them until much later. Hopefully they become much more available, right? So Yeah, those are kind of the book facts and kind of some thoughts on that. The show actually focuses on John Blackthorne, a British pilot, which means a navigator, highly educated, but kind of crass and kind of a bit dumb, honestly, who is the last surviving member of the leaders of a Dutch vessel. I can't remember what type of vessel it is, but it is a big ship. It has 20 cannons, 500 guns, and a bunch of ammunition. He, alongside with another dozen men, managed to make landfall in Japan and are quickly put under custody because Japan at this time is vaguely isolationist. Not so isolationist like they are properly after this time period, but at this point, they are only friendly with the Portuguese. The Portuguese have done everything they can in order to hide Japan away from the rest of the world. And John Blackthorne and the other 5 ships that he sailed with managed to find a way to get through Magellan's Pass, which means going down the southern tip of South America, across and then into Japan, right? So they circumvented the world this way instead of going that way to get to Japan. It was a derelict ship. It was a bad trip. They managed to get there. They're immediately accused of piracy by the Portuguese people that see them there. Of course, they are technically pirates, but they're not. Like in this case, when they arrive in Japan, their goal wasn't to pillage Japanese settlement or Japanese, villages. It was actually just to find a way to get trade with Japan and kind of remove the power that Portugal has through kind of cutting down on their exclusive ship trading rights, right? You can argue that John is a bad guy or not, or not all day long. I don't really care about that. That is not the point of the series, nor is it a point that I care to bother with, right? But yeah, so after that, we follow John as he is taken prisoner. One of his men is killed he's boiled alive. And I can't remember if it's boiled with water or oil. I think with oil is worse, but it didn't look like that. And he's boiled in a giant pot, and it's horrifying. You get to see like his skin slush off. John doesn't see this, but he knows that he died. And then, for some reason, in Japan, in the main city in Japan, Osaka, I think, which was the old capital, something happens with the Taiko, which is the ruler of Japan. Now, it's kind of confusing because I think Japan has an emperor, and then they have a warlord, and that warlord is actually the powerful figure in Japan at all times. But the Taiko wasn't really a warlord as much as he was like a peacekeeper, right? And so the emperor aspect doesn't really come into play at all. That is a non-existent kind of character, right? Like, I'm sure they're there somewhere, but they're not really relevant to the story. The Taiko has recently died, and so he left 5 men in charge. One of them happens to be Toranaga, who's played by Hiroyuki Sanada, and he is more or less the other main character. And he is being outed, impeached by the other 4 regents because they don't like the way that he has amassed power much more efficiently and better off than them. However, the Taiko privately and personally told Toranaga to save his child, to protect his child. And so Toranaga, you can argue, is doing all of these things in order to do that, right? However, this doesn't really seem to be a main focus in the story at this point, and I don't think it ever will. And Toranaga is just kind of playing the long game, kind of slowly but surely moving pieces where they need to be in order for him to be able to get out of this situation, avoid dying after they impeach him, because they would most likely behead him or ask him to commit seppuku, which is Japanese ritualistic suicide, specifically for like samurai, right? And he's trying to avoid doing that, and he's also trying to set up the best way to fight off these 4 other people. So when John Blackthorne arrives, he doesn't happen to be Portuguese, but he has a big ship with a bunch of cannons. Toranaga sees the opportunity and tries to seize it. He sends his buddy Hiromatsu down to where John managed to land, which is in this place called Ajiro, which is under the control or within the fiefdom of Yabushige, who is basically the first main big Japanese character that we meet. We get to meet his nephew Omi first, but Omi's not really that important. Yabushige is the main guy, and you know who he is because he wears this like crow feather vest, and he looks awesome. And also, I just want to say, Yabushige is probably my favorite character. He is hilarious. He is a disgusting, horrible snake. He's a weird pervert, but he's just so fun, and it's really enjoyable to see him try to be so smart, to try to play everything in his favor, and then always have Toranaga do like the one thing that he didn't expect to make it all be like not to his benefit. And it's always so funny, and his reactions are always quite enjoyable, right? So Yabushige is probably my favorite character, but he is pretty fucked up. I wouldn't necessarily say that any of the characters in the show are villains, except maybe the Catholics, right? And I don't say this because they're Catholic. I say this because they're more or less the only people that benefit from keeping Japan the way it is. And they are more or less the people behind all of the moves that the Japanese regions that happen to be Catholic are doing, right? So you can argue that they're really the only villains. However, everyone else is kind of just vying for power in a way that isn't necessarily villainous, right? And so Yabushige is probably the closest you get to a villain character that is relevant to the story most of the time. But he's more like he's just kind of like out for himself. And I really enjoy that character, right? So he sends Hiramatsu down to Achiro. They meet with Yabushige, and John is given to Hiramatsu. They take him back to Osaka. He meets a Spanish sailor. His name is Rodriguez. And he helps John kind of get his bearing, understand where he is, what he's doing, kind of start learning the language a little bit. And he gets a friend out of this, and also a very important plot point later where Rodriguez manages to help John survive a really crazy ordeal because John saved him early on in this part of the story when Rodriguez almost drowns because he can't swim because he's crazy, right? So, yeah, he makes it to Osaka. He is brought to Toranaga, and we get introduced to our third main character, or at least the character that I find most appealing and interesting, who is Mariko, who's usually called Lady Maria by the Portuguese, who happens to be the daughter of the guy that killed the previous warlord before the Taiko. So, in real history, the guy that they murdered that I mentioned is supposed to be Oda Nobunaga, who is like Japan's greatest warlord, also most feared, like most fucked up person in history. Right, well, I mean, maybe you could argue some of the people in charge in World War II were more fucked up, but Oda Nobunaga is like a very important big figure, right? And Mariko's father, in real history, is supposed to be the guy that murdered him in order to make Japan more peaceful. Then the Taiko, who was, in real history, Nobunaga's, like, page boy, basically, like his like, squire, you could call him, and also kind of his nephew, I think, took charge. And then he and Toranaga, who is actually called Iyasu something in real life, managed to save Mariko from execution, and she is now indebted to Toranaga. She is married to Hiramatsu's son, and she is very able to speak Portuguese. She's had lessons in Portuguese for the last 14 years, and so she and Toranaga sit there in audience with John, or actually John is in audience with Toranaga, while this Portuguese preacher called Martin kind of tells him what's going on, right? So he translates for John. He does so truthfully and without bias, and this is one, good for Martin because, you know, he's part of the Catholic, so he is more or less the villain of this story, but he's actually a very nice man. And two, it introduces us to Mariko, which also is helpful because now Mariko can serve as the interpreter, and we can cut out the Portuguese, which is important because John manages to, after a very weird kerfuffle where Yabushige saves him from prison and execution, tells Toranaga, this is very confusing, isn't it? But it is so good. Tells Toranaga the truth, right? He tells him about the Treaty of Tordesillas, or Tordesillas, I think is the proper way of saying that, which is the treaty where Spain and Portugal divided the world in two, and we're like, okay, Spain gets the New World, and Portugal gets everything east of Africa, right, or east of Spain, which means that Portugal got the worst deal, but Portugal is a significantly smaller country, so it makes sense that they wouldn't really be able to hold so much, and Japan is right smack in the middle of the region that Portugal owns, right? And so John tells them that the Portuguese regard Japan as their settlement, and they're hoping to remove all of the Japanese leaders and replace them with Christian overlords, Catholic overlords. And this makes Toranaga quite angry, and kind of starts the idea that Toranaga is going to remove the Portuguese from himself and also use John, who happens to bring a lot of the same things that the Portuguese did in terms of like weaponry and strategy and tactics and power as his tool, right? And so basically John is vassaled or like forced into service for Toranaga. He's given a vassalship or something equivalent, and especially after he manages to survive this scuffle on these boats, and manages to make it so that Toranaga does not have to depend on the Portuguese. He is given the title of Hatamoto. This is about the end of chapter 3, which means that John Blackthorn is now the warlord, or the main bannerman of Toranaga. And so this gives him station, this gives him power, this gives him a house and a woman, and this is when we introduce Fuji-sama. And Fuji actually was introduced earlier, where she lost her purpose because her family was killed, because they insulted Ishido, who is the main antagonist to Toranaga, on behalf of the regents, right? On the other regents' situation. He's going to be the main guy against which Toranaga fights, probably. And so Fuji is given to John as his consort, but John's like, I don't need a woman, I don't need anything, I just need to go home, and no one is letting him, so, shit sucks for John. At this point, there's still more story to come, and actually kind of the best parts of the story are around this area. I do want to say that at this point, I really like the show, because I really like the way that the female characters are portrayed here. Especially, I think in episode 4, Fuji takes the role of consort to be very important. She Mariko gets John his guns back. So now John is armed the same way everyone else in Japan is, which is good. And Fuji, as his consort, is supposed to do everything she can in order to safeguard his home and all of his things, right? And so when Omi shows up to take the guns away from John, she actually tells John to give the guns to her because she has a higher station than Omi, so Omi can't actually take them away from her. And then when Omi tries to push this issue, she actually loads the gun and points it at Omi's face and tells him to leave. And so John earns a lot of respect for Fuji, enough so that he gives her one of the guns as a gift. He's like, if you are trying to protect us in our house, you need to do so with the best thing, and so I will give you my best weapon. And she reciprocates by giving him her family swords, right? And so now John is Hatamoto. He has swords, he has a house, he has a pair of family members, or household members that he trusts in Mariko and Fuji, and things are looking up for him, right? Like, technically everything is going well. Eventually he will be able to go home if he does what he's supposed to, which in this case is teach the Japanese people here under the charge of Yabushige and Nakadoka, or Nakodogaka, I think is his name, is Yoshi Toranaga's son. Teach those men under their banners to use muskets, to use tactics that the other samurai would not expect, right? European battle tactics. However, John is not actually a warrior, although I honestly think he should be. My understanding is that pilots were highly educated navigators, but if he's like a pirate, he should also have some level of like combat experience, and also he probably learned navigation or piloting as a Navy man, and so he should have battle training, right? Because he mentions very clearly once that he was taught, right, like at a school. about the Battle of Malta, and so he should know this stuff. But he's like, no, I don't know anything about that. I only know sea tactics, and in this case, this is meaningful because that means that John can teach them how to use cannons effectively, which apparently the Portuguese didn't bother to do. And so John is now teaching Yabushige and Yoshi's men to use cannons effectively to a crazy degree of ability, right? And this makes sense because John is used to shooting cannons in the ocean where everything's moving constantly, right? But on land, it is so much easier, and so he should be much better at it than otherwise, right? And so he manages to impress them with these abilities and gains a little bit of respect from more or less everyone. Episode 5 starts with Toranaga arriving back to Ajiro because he went off to Edo to get his army. He brings all of the men with him. Buntaro shows up again. Buntaro was Mariko's husband, and he's kind of a shitty guy, but he had this really cool moment where he sacrifices himself for the sake of everyone else, which is probably my only nitpick of this show. The only time I don't like how the show handles action and tension is when he sacrifices himself, because the last scene we see of Buntaro is when him kind of just swinging his sword like this to try to evade men that are attacking him. Like the way that scene was blocked at the end of chapter 3 or episode 3. It's probably the only time that I think the action sequences were not shot that well, because one, it makes no sense for Buntaro, who's trying to have a last stand, to run away from the pier where he can control the flow of opponents, into the opponents and then to the side of the opponents to try to go away. Like, I understand why he did this. He was trying to find a way to escape, but by doing that, he's making it easier for people to try to use the pier to chase down Toranaga, and also he's putting himself in much more danger than he would otherwise, right? And so I didn't like that because, like, logically it doesn't make too much sense to me, and also because the last scene we see of him, he's not really trying to fight properly. He's not doing his best to make these graceful, samurai moves. He's just doing this weird, like, oh, get away from me kind of thing. And that doesn't look great, right? It's a very minor nitpick. I did take a long time explaining it, but that's just because, in a show full of W's, this one L feels quite noticeable compared to everything else, right? And that's really the only issue I have with the series. And honestly, like I said, it's not that big of a deal. I was just thinking about it because I noticed it earlier today when I was rewatching the series. And so I wanted to mention it here, right? Anyway, Buntaro survived. He managed to come back, and this causes problems for John because John and Mariko have recently started hooking up in secret. So secret, in fact, that Mariko doesn't want to tell John that it was her because she thought that her husband was dead, and she's kind of interested in John, right? They had this like imaginary date beforehand at the spa or at the onsen, and then she goes and lays with him. There's quite a few memes going around about the fact that she waited until he took a bath in order to be with him because he doesn't like showering apparently. And so Buntaro kind of fucks up everything, right? He shows up to the house. He gets really drunk alongside John, but they don't like each other. And when John is trying to be amicable, Buntaro just throws everything back at his face. He gets angry. He almost kills Mariko, trying to show off his battle skills. And then he almost kills her just because he's angry at her. And this makes John angry as well. And so John kind of confronts him. Buntaro seems to want to suicide himself in order to make amends. But because John doesn't understand him, he doesn't let him, or he doesn't accept that. And so he leaves. And I think this is actually a really interesting point because did Buntaro do this knowing that John would not be able to accept? And so it's like a dishonorable thing? Or did he do this expecting John to shoot him so that would be honorable and John would be the one with the bad responsibility on his head because he was killing a very important member of Torinaga's army? Or was he doing it expecting to be accepted, and then when John doesn't, this is like a slight against Buntaro? I'm not really sure what the concept was there. And I'm very interested to see what happens in episode 6. Episode 5 finally finishes with John talking to Toranaga. There's a situation where one of John's servants is killed because of something he said flippantly, and he blames himself for this death, and he hates the way that the country handles death, the way that they kind of don't treat life as important, and he asked Toranaga for permission to leave Japan forever. Of course, Toranaga ignores this request, and then a giant landslide happens. Toranaga is swept away in the sand, in the dirt. John manages to save him. Toranaga has lost his sword, which is a bad omen. John gives him the swords that Fuji recently gave him, and Toranaga takes them, and he actually laughs. And there's kind of unknown reasons for this laugh. I think it's the ironic sense that Toranaga thinks that it's funny that this guy that doesn't really want to be here continues to save his life constantly, and be helpful to him constantly, right? Others think that it's because John gave Toranaga swords that actually are not honorable, because Fuji's swords are not actually what she thinks they are. Everyone kind of has this like inside knowledge about what the swords really are, and they're not what Fuji thinks, and so everyone kind of just goes along with what Fuji says out of respect for her. And some people think that Toranaga laughed because of this, but I don't think that that's it. I don't think that Toranaga knows. I think that only Mariko and maybe a few other people might know, like, you know, Hiramatsu, who's her father-in-law, and also the grandfather of Fuji, right? Because he's the one that bought those swords. And I don't think Toranaga knows. And I think he's just laughing at the fact that John wants to leave, doesn't want to be involved, and somehow always ends up involving himself in a way that makes Toranaga have to keep him around, right? So I think that's why he's laughing. And that is a very devastating end to the episode. And that's where the series is right now. And it's quite good. I really enjoy it. I love Mariko a lot. I love Fuji. I think her badass moment with the gun is great. I also really love her physical acting. This actress, she's quite young. She's only a few years older than me. And she has this really interesting ability to show surprise and enjoyment of things very subtly. And actually, I think most of the Japanese actors are able to do this quite well. More so than I've ever thought American ones have done. But maybe that's because of the situations that they're put in. Because the show is so traditional in its approach to Japanese and so accurate to reality, most of these characters have to wear these very blank, expressionless masks. And so they have to do these very subtle, kind of tiny, like micro expression type things in order to show amusement and distrust and surprise and all of this. And they all manage to do so quite well. And I think Fuji is probably the best one. I think that just the way that she does things and the way that she reacts when they're having this dinner where Buntaro and John kind of get upset at each other, is just great. Mariko has this very interesting kind of dilemma where she's quite powerful as like a right-hand assistant to Toranaga, but also because of just who she is, her family history, and the fact that she's a woman and married to Hiramatsu, kind of to a Hiramatsu clan member, makes her kind of like not as powerful as she should be. We also get introduced to the third major female character here, which is Ochiba. And she's the queen, or essentially a widow. I think she was a consort to Taiko. She is the mother of the emperor to be, the young boy, or the Taiko to be, I guess. And she shows up. She has this like anime villain voice, and she wants to take control of things, right? And so I like all of these characters. I like how they show their abilities, their power, how they conform to their society and stuff really well. I like Yabushige a lot, like I said, and I don't necessarily like John, actually. I don't think he's like a particularly likable character. He's not disliked, like unlikable either. I just think that my admiration for John is not because of him, but rather because of the way that the other characters react to him, right? Like every time Toranaga does that little smirk thing whenever John does something cool or interesting, I'm like, oh shit, John is awesome, but it's not because of John, it's because of the reaction Toranaga had, right? Anytime I feel like John has these really interesting kind of introspective moments, they're not because of John necessarily, but rather because I'm much more interested in the reaction that Mariko has to him, which is usually kind of this like level of endearment, increasing, or maybe this kind of like surprise at the fact that he is like this, so different from the men that she knows and stuff like that. Like, does that make sense? I like John. I don't like him as much as Yabushige or Mariko or Toranaga or Fuji or hell, even Ishido. Actually, no, never mind. That's wrong. I do like him more than Ishido. I don't like Ishido at all. But I don't necessarily think that he is like my favorite character. And not because he's kind of like the everyman character, because he has to be the one through which we experience like this world of Japan. Just because I don't necessarily think that he is doing these things out of the reason that everyone else thinks that he's doing them. Because he has this kind of like freedom approach, right, to life. He basically should be on Luffy's crew, right? Like he's a pirate. Every time they say Kaizoku, I'm like, oh shit, One Piece. He wants to be free. He goes off into the ocean like Usopp's dad to avoid responsibilities because he has 2 family members that he left behind. He just wants to exist without responsibilities, or actually not even without responsibilities, but rather being able to pick his responsibilities. And so he thinks that the best way to do this is to ally himself with Toranaga and eventually do what he needs to do for Toranaga to leave him alone and be able to return home, right? And he is responsible for the men that were with him, so he's always asking about them, even though he never sees them. And so I don't think that he's necessarily against responsibility. He's just against being forced to do things. He doesn't want to bow down to any lord, right? But he has to. He has to bow down to Toranaga, do what is best for Toranaga, so that he can get what he wants out of it, right? And so I definitely understand those motivations, but they're not necessarily heroic motivations or motivations that make me want to root for John, right? And so when I do root for John, they're not necessarily those emotions are not necessarily born of me enjoying John's kind of reality or situation or the way that he interacts with people, his character specifically, but rather the way that everyone else reacts to his actions, right? So I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe not. Maybe you understand, maybe you don't. If you do, let me know in the comments. Tell me how you would explain what I just said, because I think it's a pretty understandable kind of like concept, but I don't necessarily know that I explained it the right way, right? So yeah. Otherwise, like, the show looks great. It has great sound. There's a lot of cool things. I did think of something else, though. There is a second kind of thing that I want to mention that I think is not great. And that is that, at least in the first 2 episodes, I stopped noticing it after the 3rd one. It looks like the camera that they're using has, like, blurring on the edges. So, like this part where my hand is making a circle is super sharp. And then everything outside of that is blurry. Now, I don't know if that's because it's trying to tell us something and I just didn't pick up on what the message is, or if it's just something that they decided to switch out of after the 2nd episode. Because I feel like by the 3rd episode, things are clear everywhere. Like, the whole screen looks clear, not just like the centerpiece, right? But maybe it's just because I got used to it. I'm not really sure, but I remember rewatching the first 2 episodes last night and really being annoyed at the fuzziness of the edges of the screen, because I was watching it on my computer monitor sitting on my bed, which is about 7 feet away. And my computer monitor is significantly smaller than the TV that I usually watch the show at, right? And so it was much easier to notice these problems for some reason, even though it should probably be the opposite way. And I noticed them and I couldn't really stop looking at them. And it bothered me a bit, right? But I think this goes away. I'm not really sure. I think it was like a choice that they had, and then they realized, oh, maybe this is the best, so they moved it away. Or there might be like a thematic element to this, where the first 2 episodes are like this because we're kind of supposed to be feeling like everything is hazy visually and, you know, situationally, because John is very confused, right? And then in the 3rd episode, when John finally has some concrete revelatory kind of situations and he knows where he stands, the blurriness goes away, right? So I'm not really sure. Let me know what you guys think about that down below. And that is more or less basically all my thoughts on this show, Shogun, which was amazing. I recommend you guys watch it, although I basically more or less gave you a catch-up, a kind of review video here, where I just tell you everything about it up to this. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I didn't mention, so you can still watch the show and still feel like you didn't, get spoiled for everything. But you could more or less start watching episode 6 with no problems after this. And this is going to be pretty good for me on Tuesday morning before I sit down to watch the episode with my roommate on Tuesday night, right? So, yeah, there you go. Those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys thought down below. Let me know what you think about Shogun. Is it just me that can't find affordable copies of the books or not? Let me know down below, and thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys later.